Hey everybody, what's up? Today's Wednesday, April 13th, and I'm going to be talking about AMC stock. I've got a couple different things I want to talk about today. I'm just going to go as quickly as possible because I don't want to make this super long. First of all, I just want to talk about the inverse relationship between ATER and AMC. So it seems to me, and it's been like this for several days, maybe even longer, that AMC and ATE are kind of running like liquid opposite. It's not that they're not completely mirrored, but they are in a similar um there's like similarities between some of the regions. So if you're looking at for example, let's say you're looking at this region right here and you're just looking at fractals alone. So let's say the 6th through the 8th. You'd see a lot of the similar patterns. The difference is that while AMC has been trending down, ATR has been largely trending upward. And this, of course, started with a really massive run on and around April 1st to April 4th. At the same time, AMC was experiencing the first of many of these big iterative steps down. And it started with this down motion on April 4th, this hard down motion while ATR was running. And it was timed almost the same. If you look at the timing of it, when this run stopped, AMC was basically at its bottom, right? And then it kind of recovered and went sideways. And you can see that even the aftermath of that, ATER kind of bounced going up, and AMC had this sort of inverse bounce. So ever since then, I've been kind of paying more attention to it because it just seemed really odd to me. And when we came into this final range here, it was very apparent that they were not allowing AMC to run. Whatever algorithm does what it wants to do, doesn't seem to want to allow them to run at the same time. So interestingly, there was a couple pictures that I posted about the liquid, and if you look at certain regions like this pocket right here versus this pocket, even the even the actual volume range, you could just tell it was mirrored. And sure enough, today during the first portion of the day, the stock, both of them kind of had an upward momentum, but ATER, if you see it, actually did it yesterday. And if you look here, it went sideways while AMC was trending upward. And then as soon as it starts trending up again, so it opened here, it went sideways, starts trending upward. As soon as it starts trending upward, AMC starts trending sideways and down. And it doesn't stop until basically right here. You see where this finally broke down? That was a little bit after noon. So AMC also breaks down, and then they almost look like they're going to run in tandem, but then they deviate right around roughly power hour. They start going opposite directions again. So it's not like they're running complete opposites. It's more like there's sort of like this weird, I don't know if it's hedging or if it's like liquidity shifting or what, like why it's doing what it's doing. That's a big question. I don't know. But it's just really interesting. So if you're in ATER, I had anticipated, I'm not going to say much more about this, but I had anticipated that we were probably going to ride this channel up as far as we could, maybe get up to 7. And 7 is a really important test because I'm going to have to go back a little further. I'm going to go to like the 3 hour. It is the macro downtrend. And I do think that in order for this to officially be broken out, if you will, it needs to break that downtrend. Now, that being said, the volume that came in today was pretty significant. The volume that came in on the 7th was not. And that made me think that perhaps buying was losing a little bit of steam, a little bit. But after today, I think it's probable that if there is a pullback here, it may kind of land on this shelf. And this shelf, if you can see it, sits right at $4.66, something like that. But right around there, maybe going as low as 415 or even like 388 into this liquid pocket. And that might be all it needs in order to sort of bounce and continue on. And originally I had looked at this and I was like, oh, I don't know, if it's the same composite EMU, it's probably going to want to go get these shares and so on and so forth. Well, here's the thing. AMC did go get those shares and it went down and our range was 17. So if you want to look at a comparison, if you're thinking like there's no way ATR is going to stop running, and granted, they're different stocks, okay, they're different stocks, but remember that a big part of the reason why at least I think that we stopped where we stopped is because that is the macro trend line. So both ATER and AMC, presumably, right, may stop and reject, and I mean, AMC did, it rejected off of this downtrend line, right? And it looks like it's finally gaining some footing here, and it might be forming a turnaround. Now, I think it's going to be a little bit slow, but I do think it's going to finally turn around and head back up towards 25. And I talked about that in like the previous video. I'm not going to talk about that too much more today. But the whole point of me saying this is like, this is very similar, right, to the setup that we now see with ATER. Like it finally broke out and it's running hard and you're like, oh, there's no way it's going to stop. And then all of a sudden it abruptly just stops, right? And they just dump it. And it's, in this case, it went all the way down to the 786. So my scaling here is on log, but this actually is a linear scaling for my fib retracement. And it did come down to that 786 on that fib retracement. So if something similar were to happen for ATER, you can see that, look at where this pocket is. See right here? So this is where we ended up, is right in between these two. I mean, it looks almost identical in some ways. It's kind of spooky, right? How similar this bottom is in terms of the VPVR, like the visible range. It's set up the same way too. It's just that when we were running, ATR was going sideways. So again, it's kind of like it almost was going in tandem and then all of a sudden it just stopped. And they kept ATER low while AMC was running. So now I think if AMC starts to finally move, I think we're going to see that while AMC is moving, I think ATER might be experiencing its pullback. So it went all the way back down to the 786. So if the something similar were to happen, let's say it breaches it just a bit or whatever, it goes to like 7 or 725, you can see that the 786 is that $3.30 mark. If it only went up to 7, you're looking at somewhere right around 3 to 325. So again, that's this pocket right here, right below this massive buy zone, which is what happened to AMC, assuming that AMC is actually turning around and exits the range here that it's currently in. So that's why I'm not like super confident that, oh, it's just going to keep going. I understand that there's like no more loanable shares, so on and so forth, but AMC's been like 100% utilization forever, it seems like, and they still were able to do this. So never underestimate the power of selling and synthetic shorts. So that being said, I'm going to switch over to just talking about AMC exclusively for the rest of the video. I've got a bunch of information that I want to share with you. Some of it's really interesting, and I've got a bit to talk about. So first of all, I've been tracking this here and there every day and looking at the way that this is formed. This right here, this particular fractal right here is basically the January move. I know it doesn't look like it at first glance. You're like, well, that doesn't look anything like it. But remember, as we're forming these sequences, the micro sequence that's within here should represent what's also going to happen on the macro and vice versa. So for each formation, so if you're forming like a T3, which is just a big cup and handle, you're going to see that kind of similar setup, right? And you'll notice that the sequencing also matches. So some folks have pointed out, and rightly so, that this downtrend looks a lot like what we saw over here, this downtrend, and it has a similar kind of bottom region. But again, remember at this point, the algorithm is switching from into a spring, right? A big spring, and it's turning out, okay, to become this new fractal as it's running up. The sequence doesn't change. Like, it's made up of the same 1, 2, 3 parts, right? I mean, there's not that many parts to it, but the way that it shapes does change. So if the way that it shapes in this section is to look like this kind of big January looking cup and handle pattern, then it makes sense that you would see that shift, right, occurring as soon as the bottom there. So what I'm looking at here is basically not a 1-to-1, but I am looking at it as, okay, if I look at the sequencing, you can see that when it peaked in January, it actually looks a lot like this when it came back down. So just to kind of repeat that and just sort of show you really quickly, this isn't meant to be like profound either, because we've been talking about this for a while. So that doesn't mean that I think that we're going to peak, go sideways, and then run up, but we might. It may end up looking a little like that. It's more or less like, you got to remember this is a micro, and so that could happen on the micro, like as soon as tomorrow. Like you could see something like this form tomorrow, and then it starts running up. But I'm not saying it has to look like this, because remember that on the macro, on the like zoomed out view, this whole thing is really supposed to be trending upward. So what happened here is probably like what we're about to see. And remember that this is also, I've said remember a lot, but if you recall, this is a T3, or excuse me, a T-test section, which means there's a T1, T2, T3 in here. And I've already shown that and proved that in previous sequence videos, and like a long time ago, back in January. All of these bottom breakouts always have a T-test in them right here, and they always end with a T3. So would it make sense if we get to the ending of this sequencing here and you get this kind of cup and handle formation? Yes, it would. So what would that look like? Well, it depends on what this is right here, this little bump, but I imagine that essentially, like, you see how this is the top and then this is the top? Well, there's a small gap right here, and it's almost invisible because I've got the Heiken Hashi, but it's like a 1863 or something like that. And we're not quite there yet. We like almost got there today. But I kind of think that perhaps this, and I think there was a gap here as well. I think perhaps this got to that spot, and then it kind of like bonked its head, right? And starts back down. So if that were to occur, it's just a hypothetical. Because in this case, I'm not positive that it's going to happen like in one day, or if it does happen, it could be more like curved upward, you know? It doesn't have to be perfectly level just like this one was. It's possible that it will be, but it doesn't have to be. So let's say that were to happen tomorrow. Maybe what would occur is essentially you get this breakout here, and this is basically this whole cup formation. So it comes back down, retest this kind of trend line looking thing, and then you would get this formation right here, and it would look like it's about to run, and it would. And then basically on Monday, you'd be looking at this kind of a push up all the way to like $25 or something ridiculous, right? Because that, remember on the macro, like that's kind of the level that we're looking at it going up here. So maybe it wouldn't be that high. Maybe it would only be up to, I don't know, 21 or something, and then it goes sideways a bit, and then it climbs again to 22, and then it starts climbing again. It peaks out at 25. That would make a lot of sense based on these little gaps that it left on the way down, that it would kind of hesitate. They're not really there, are they? Maybe like 20, 22, and then that's about it. So 20 or 22, right? And then that's it. You get to 25. And then you start the macro version of this, okay, bull. And for that, I have other charts. I'm not going to get into the macro stuff today. I've been talking about that a lot in different videos. I'm going to switch gears. And I just want to talk about this for the rest of the video. So this is a weird thing that happened today that I'm going to turn off. This is the Wyckoff sniper, which is the one that Astro built. And I believe there were a lot of other people who contributed to that. But so credit where credit's due. I think that, I think Trey might have been somebody that Square Root of 9 that helped with that. I think in the beginning, it was based on one of his ideas about the sine wave stuff that was working really well. But this is something that I've been kind of poking my brain at for a while. So if you recall, I'm going to pull up a couple things. So I'm going to pull up this. I don't have. I really wish I had the 3-minute all the way back still, but it got like outdated. I have to look at the 5-minute now. All right, so this is like the bread and butter fractal. There's everything in it. I go to it all the time. I'm not going to explain why right now, but this is it. So this is everything. And for a little while, I've been talking about these platforms. All right, so there's one here. This is like this light pink one. I'm going to zoom in a bit. I'm just going to go here. Oops. It's a really important concept to understand. So in the bridge, what happens when the bridge starts is that you basically get the end of the sequence. So this is like a T1, T2, T3 sequence. It's a full sequence right here. And then at the end of the sequence, instead of breaking out, you break down and you start cascading down. This was what happened November 22nd, 2021, all right, on the macro. But I think we were more or less like over here on this one, okay? Don't worry about that. Don't think too hard about it. Just know that whenever we break down, instead of breaking up, it's called a replicant spring. That's what I call it. And it's because it forms this hook, and the hook doesn't break out. When the hook does break out, like it does here, you get a huge markup. So the whole point of this is they're going down and then they're coming back through or combing back through to acquire shares, right, in this lower liquidity zone because they didn't pick them up over here, or they want more. Well, when this occurs, if you draw a line from like the previous base through the hook, and it can be sort of an average, it will point to essentially where the next top is because these things tend to form on an arc. It's very strange. But I've tested it out and it works pretty much every time, almost perfectly. It's just that drawing this line can be a little difficult. Okay, so here it is right here, here it is right here, and then here it is over here. So these are the replicant springs here, here, and here. We break down, and then it points to the next top. So that's one principle that I kind of identified early on that I've been using. Another one is that if you look where these kind of establish on the arc when they land, you can draw a line backwards to the previous top, and you can see that it's sort of like a crossing of the creek in a way, but it's like laying on top of, you see that? It like kind of lays on top of this trend line that's shared with like the previous peak region. It's not always like the peak, right? So you can't always go, I mean, you can draw this all the way back to here and you can see it actually has another touch point. And I think that's legitimate. I don't really think it matters too much, but suffice to say, like I noticed that as well. So this is one of the reasons why I think that on the macro, we're kind of in this sequence right here, and we're going to have to break out and form a cat ear sequence around 30 to 40. Like it's going to look like this, where it breaks out and it comes back and retests that macro trend line that's going down that I mentioned earlier on AMC. And I think that's going to happen on the macro. So I don't think it's just going to go straight up. I think it's going to go up to like 40 or 45 and then come back down, test it, eventually form a spring and then leave. And so I've tested this out, and this is also a true statement. Like this occurs on pretty much every single one of these fractal setups. It's just that when it's irregular, it's really, really hard to draw it because it's just really difficult. Like if you take this and you warp it around a curve, right, you can't identify the parts like very easily. So it works best when it's very clear and very horizontal. And if it's vertical and if it's staggered or whatever, it's just nearly impossible to do it. So it's just because it's so visually, it's so off. It makes it really hard to find the parts. So it really works best when it's a very clear range to range, like, simple range vertically, and then if it moves fairly horizontal, then that'd be perfect. So one thing that I learned and discovered recently, and it just kind of clicked, that when I was looking at this visually, I was like, hey, it's kind of weird that you can see where they intersect. In this case, it's not like really perfect, but if you look at more like this, all right, you can see that general area where they intersect, okay? You can see that it lands basically like on the bottom or the spring. So here it's like the lowest point, and then here it's not quite the spring, it's a little before it, but it's basically the lowest point. And then here, this one is pretty off, but it's pretty close still. I mean, it's not like ridiculously far off from like the lowest point. I was like, that's a weird phenomena. Maybe I should test that out on the macro view. And so I looked and I tried, and sure enough, if you draw is it on this one? Maybe not. Yeah, let's try it on this one. Yeah, that's a mess. But yeah, sure enough, if you draw like from the base through the hook, and you can draw your hook in various ways. I mean, in some ways it's like it's not that important because it's so close to where you want to be anyways. So like here, you would draw it here, and that's actually really close to the low. But if you drew it this way, it's almost right on where we actually sprung from. And I've tried it in almost every single area. It works really consistently. And I think that's really odd. So if you can identify, for instance, like right here, you can see this is the big downtrend line, right? And you can identify like, okay, well, there's the hook, right? So if I can draw from here to here, you can see that it lays down pretty much right. If you look at like the base, remember, versus through the hook, it lays down right here. And that's right where our spring is. So it works on the macro. And I tried it out on the smaller time frame, which is kind of confusing. I know this chart's like a huge mess, but you can see this downward trend here. And remember, this is a nested sequence. So if this is on the low part, then we would expect this to be the top part, right? So it would work on the nested sequence that's inside the bridge as well. And sure enough, if you do the cross section, look at where the center is. It's like right on the turning point, okay, on one of the springs. So really fascinating. It's not like perfect, because I think it's just not possible to draw it like perfectly every time. And maybe it's more or less, not about. And here's the thing: is like I went and looked at a sine wave because I was like, I think this is like a mathematical principle, and I'm just sort of not being really mathematical about it. So if you look at a sine wave and you basically cut it in half, and then you draw from one peak to the next, you can see that where it intersects, right, that's where you cross. And so there's a lot of interesting things with sine waves, right, that have to do with the crossing of tangents, right, from different peaks and whatever. Well, if you go from the top and you skip a wave, right, to the next bottom, you can see that where it intercepts this cross section here is basically the spring action. This is exactly what I'm doing. So this would be like the top of January, right, down to the next spring, and this is that motion going through that we just saw, right, where it lays on, it goes down, goes above it, and then lays on top of it, and then launches. So it's not like it's mathematically sound. It makes sense. So the problem is like, how would you do this in real time? And I was like, I don't really know. Maybe you can't do it in real time. Well, I did it today in real time. And in real time, it was really bizarre because I did it kind of wrong at first. And I got screenshots and stuff. I'm not going to pull up screenshots to like prove anything or something. But the way that I did it originally is I drew this line right here. And I looked at, I think it was, no, that was the first one. But I guess I was looking over here and I wasn't sure. I was like, well, that kind of looks like this might be the hook. It's really ugly and you can't really tell. Remember how I said it's not horizontal. It makes it really difficult because it's hard to tell like what's supposed to be what here. Well, somehow I ended up picking out this marker at like noon, or not noon, but power hour. And I was like, okay, it looks to me like if I were to do it, I might have to pull up those screenshots because I don't think I can explain this. Said I wasn't going to do it, but I'm going to do it. Because it's just difficult to sort of get. Like, so when I was looking at it, I was looking at the setup and I thought that this might be this dip right here. It still might be. And this may end up being like the very final top at like 25, like way later. Or better yet, this is actually a T3 fractal over here on this side, the cup and handle looking fractal. It just broke down at the end instead of going up. This might be what we see tomorrow. So it kind of coincides. Anyways, this is how I did it when I first did it. So I looked at this area and I thought, okay, well, there seems to be an intercept. And I think I said it was about power hour. Yeah, I fixed it. And you can't see it on the timestamp here. But it was like, okay, about an hour before close is what it looked like. So this is kind of what I was imagining, is that somehow about an hour before close, we're going to get a big boost. And then as I was going along, I switched it to, let me see if I can find another screenshot of it. I changed it a little bit. I think it goes back up top here. Yeah, so I started shifting it around and I was watching this form right here and I thought that looks a little like the hook, but it's like too attached to the top. So I don't think that's the hook. And then I imagine, well, what if this is the bottom and it's actually like rising? And so I started drawing other lines. And then this is what I came up with. And the first two intercepts were actually like these crosses right here. And if you did a drop down, it was the first two hits on that. So it's kind of strange. It's almost like you're drawing, if you look at it really simply, it's like you're drawing wedges, right? But you're drawing them with like different touch points. So there's like one here and then one here, and then where that wedge ends, it terminates, you basically have this breakdown, right? But when it hits that point, it's really bizarre. It acted like a time marker. So then I hit another one, right? So this is not correct. This is not what I used, but I ended up shifting all of them around because I was like, what am I aiming for here? Why did I pick out power hour? And I had forgotten already, because if you look at the next chart, I got rid of that bottom line. See that red line? So I couldn't remember, like, why did I pick power hour? Because I just forgot. So I picked all these markers and I was like, this is really odd. I don't know what I'm doing here. But I kept following it. And sure enough, that marker ended up being really important. Well, it did not hit the price targets that I was aiming for, but it did almost perfectly connect to every one of these. So what we ended up with was basically this like perfect timing of like 3 bounces, which is super significant because I did it in real time. I did it before it started. And in addition to that, if you look, remember, this is another thing I had talked about, was this S wave thing. When you have this sine wave going, when it finally hits the bottom and it launches off the sine wave, like it launches off the center line, it takes off. Well, these center markers were established on this head and shoulder. So they established this strange center marker, and I have like two things here because it's kind of wide. There's another marker here. This one has like 3 or 4 touch points. So it's a little bit more like a range. Well, this was established early on, and this ends up being what essentially is followed as like the major trend, right? If you got rid of all the noise, this is just whipsawing around it. When it finally gets here and it lands on it and it rejects off of it, it just goes. But what's fascinating to me is just that these intersects, right? And there's a few of them that didn't pan out. So like here's one right here that nothing happened. It went down, right? But these particular ones, right, that I had kind of played with early on, this one being, I think, the actual hook right here. And then this one being kind of a second hook. And I was using these 2 touch points because that seemed really obvious. Well, basically, like you could time these perfectly. So the next step was then, well, what could I do to take this a step further and like make sure this is actually legit? I don't know yet. I have to still do some more work on it. It's not like I'm done. But it's pretty significant, and I think it's a significant finding. And I popped on Astro's Wyckoff sniper and found that basically when these contract, okay, when the bands contract, so this is supposed to help you identify springs. And when the bands contract, you tend to get kind of big motions out of a range. So if you start a range and they start contracting, you get big motions out of a range. And that's when basically there's no more liquidity to be explored, right? So the bands will contract and then you move on to the next range. Well, I noticed that in both of these cases right here, the places where the bands start contracting, this was a very similar setup to this in some regards. Like this is a 4-top, right? And then that creates a hook. This is a 4-top and that creates a hook. So similar in that regard. When this hook happened, it happens kind of right where you see these bands kind of come together. Well, this hook is a breakdown, okay? It happened on quite a bit of volume. And when this occurred, right, it rejected and it headed out, and it goes out of this lower band significantly. I'm willing to bet that that same thing happened right here. You can see it did. There was a kind of a hook here, and it kind of happens here as well. When it contracted here in this particular region on this side, all right, the hook was tiny, and it did not reject, at least not yet. Right? We haven't seen it anything else, but it's at this point it's like way over the top. So we'll have to see how this pans out. You've seen that when this has happened sometimes in the past, it's kind of gone way back through it to sort of correct. And I think it might. I think we might see something kind of a significant maybe pullback. And it would be interesting, right, to see how and where this goes, because I'm going to keep these lines up. I'm going to see if it ends up respecting one over the other. The ramping volume's fine. We need more volume for sure on a big move, but unless we're going straight up, it's okay to have like a little bit lower volume, especially considering that this could be a micro setup here for January, right? Where we get that gap fill, and then after that, I don't know, maybe that's about it, and then it kind of comes back down and we get the cup and handle, right, set up, and then we start running to perhaps 20 or something by the end of the day. And 20 was one of the targets I looked at earlier. I think 1860 was another one I thought was pretty significant. This was something that I set up during the live stream. I'll end with that if you want to like screenshot it or something. These are the ranges that I'm looking at after it runs. At this point, right, we're kind of like running out of time. So I really do think that if it starts moving that it's going to be pretty quick. So tomorrow, if it got to like 20, then my expectation would be, yeah, I think Monday, you would start just kind of going quite hard. And maybe if it didn't, maybe this section is just too long. And if this ends up being like really long and it lasts all the way to April 21st or even later, then perhaps this section's really short. I still think that we're going to get to right around 45 or so, sometime between, May or April 25th and May 5th. And that's based on speed lines. And the same thing happened in the setup before the run to 72. And this is a micro version of that, essentially. So I kind of think that this might be too big, like too large, and it's actually going to be perhaps more compressed. That's definitely a possibility. And if that's the case, we'll get there when we get there. The only way for this to happen is for it to just go, like start moving, right? If we end up getting to a place where, this setup looks like it's taking way longer, I don't think that means the price target's necessarily wrong. You got to keep in mind that these are speed lines, so a little bit of a micro movement on these can really shift them, and that's why I picked like a range out instead of like a full-on whatever. So anyways, that's it. I wanted to share this with you. I wanted to just kind of briefly talk about what I was doing with this, and I know it might be a little confusing, but I think it's significant. I don't believe you can do it with just anything, but there might be some validity to that. So like if you were taking something like this and you drew a, I don't know, cross section here. I mean, you can just kind of draw it any way you want to draw it. Like maybe somehow you could have predicted that was going to line up with that, but to me, it's not like that. I have to see a sequence that makes sense. So I have to see that that bridge start, like right before the bridge. I have to see it start forming. So that would be like identifying that foretop and then that hook, and then you could probably make a prediction. But you can't do it. I mean, you could have predicted this right here. I mean, perfectly, almost. But you can't do it without knowing like specific touch points. Not yet. Because we don't understand and we don't have sufficient knowledge about like the wavelength, right? Like how this wavelength works. This kind of stuff is more perfect. You might get there, but I'm still working on it. So anyways, I wanted to share that with you. I hope you all have a good one, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.